Arab millionaire poses as a driver to spy on his wife. What he finds will shock you. Hook. One man, a shattered life, and a battle for freedom against a system that controls everything. But what happens when the system breaks? The shocking truth behind the lies, betrayal, and a daring escape will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Stick with us till the end. You won't believe what happens next. Ahmed sat in the back of the black sedan, his fingers clenched around the steering wheel. It was late. The moon hung high, casting long shadows on the road. He watched her through the rearview mirror. His wife, Amina. She didn't know he was there. He had followed her for days, watching her movements, her subtle smiles and glances. Something didn't feel right. Ahmed had everything, wealth, power, a beautiful wife. But something gnawed at him. Amina had changed. The woman he married wasn't the same. She was distant, secretive. At first, he thought it was just stress. But then, the small details added up. The late nights, the hidden phone calls, the sudden trips. His suspicions grew. He had hired someone to follow her. They had given him details, too many details. Now he needed to see it for himself. He parked a block away from the cafe where Amina was meeting someone. The streetlights flickered, casting an eerie glow. Ahmed's heart raced. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, trying to remain calm. The cool night air hit his face, sending a shiver down his spine. He watched her through the cafe window. Amina was sitting across from a man, one Ahmed didn't recognize. They were laughing, speaking softly. His blood boiled. Why hadn't she told him about this? He wanted to rush in, confront her, but something stopped him. He stayed outside, watching. The man reached across the table, brushing his hand against hers. Amina didn't pull away. Ahmed's vision blurred. His thoughts swirled with anger and confusion. Why was she doing this? The seconds stretched into eternity. The man leaned closer. Amina smiled, leaning in, whispering something into his ear. Ahmed couldn't hear her words, but he didn't need to. His chest tightened. It felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, his foot froze. Amina's eyes met his through the window. Her gaze was empty, like she had known all along, like she had been waiting for this moment. Amina didn't even blink. She slowly stood up, her hand brushing against the man's shoulder. Ahmed's heart shattered. The realization hit him like a freight train. She had known. She had always known. And worse, she had been playing him. His legs gave way, and he stumbled back, almost falling. He had to get out. The truth was unbearable. He ran into the dark alley behind the cafe, gasping for breath. The world felt like it was closing in. Tears welled up in his eyes. His hand gripped his chest, as if he could stop the pain. But nothing could. Not now. Not ever. His mind was spinning, chaotic thoughts crashing against each other. He staggered forward, desperate to escape the suffocating reality of what he had just seen. The cold walls of the alley seemed to press in on him. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he couldn't escape it. The image of Amina and the man, so close, so intimate, burned into his mind. It felt like betrayal, like his world was unraveling, piece by piece. How could she? He had given her everything, the luxury, the security, the status. Was it not enough? His breathing was shallow, ragged. The world around him blurred, as if the darkness had swallowed everything. He leaned against the alley wall, his legs shaking. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the narrow passage, but he couldn't move. He couldn't escape the haunting image of her smile, that smile she had once saved only for him. His eyes burned with tears, his chest tight with grief. Amina had taken it all away without a single word, without a single explanation. He had to know more. He couldn't leave without understanding. What was happening? Who was this man? Ahmed wiped his eyes, forcing himself to focus. He had to be strong. He had to uncover the truth, but his hands trembled. His mind was racing, flooded with questions. What if he was wrong? What if it was just a misunderstanding? The thought was fleeting, quickly drowned by the weight of the evidence. No, he had seen what he needed to see. The world had shifted beneath him, and he had no choice but to face it. His stomach twisted in knots. Amina's face, her eyes, haunted him as he tried to make sense of it all. How had he not seen it? How had she fooled him for so long? The pain was unbearable, like a constant ache that gnawed at his insides. He had to confront her. He had to hear it from her lips. But as he turned back toward the street, a sharp voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you all right, sir?" He spun around. A man, dark hair and wearing a black jacket, was standing in the shadows. Ahmed's heart skipped a beat. He had been so lost in his thoughts, he hadn't noticed the stranger approach. The man's eyes were intense, sharp. Something about him felt off. "Who are you?" Ahmed asked, his voice unsteady. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled a cold, knowing smile. "You should go back to your car," the man said softly. "It's safer there." The warning in his voice sent a chill down Ahmed's spine. How did this man know where he was? How did he know he had been following Amina? But before Ahmed could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving only silence in his wake. Something was wrong. This was no coincidence. The hairs on the back of Ahmed's neck stood on end. He had to find out more. What was Amina hiding? What was the truth behind this encounter? The night had only just begun, and the answers were closer than he realized. Ahmed's pulse raced as the shadowy figure melted into the dark, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in the air. He stepped forward, uncertain but determined. The man's cryptic words echoed in his mind. "It's safer there." What did that mean? Why had he warned him? Ahmed glanced around, his eyes darting between the dimly lit buildings. A heavy silence hung over the street, oppressive and unnerving. He felt the weight of every passing second, every breath like a hammering drumbeat. Should he go back to the car? Was it safer there? No. He couldn't leave, not yet. He had to confront Amina. He had to find out everything. With shaky hands, he pulled out his phone, his fingers moving almost mechanically. He called the driver, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay where you are. I need you to follow me." The driver's voice crackled through the line, confused but compliant. "Yes, sir. Right away." The call ended. Ahmed didn't waste another moment. His feet carried him back toward the cafe. His breath shallow, he tried to steady his nerves. As he neared the window, his heart twisted painfully in his chest. Amina and the man were still inside, but now they weren't just talking. They were laughing, too loudly, too freely. The man reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Amina didn't pull away. The sight burned like acid, searing his insides. Was this some kind of game to her? Had she been playing him the whole time? His mind screamed with fury, with confusion. But still, he stood there, frozen, helpless. A part of him wanted to burst through the door, confront them both. But he couldn't. Not yet. Something told him to wait, to let it unfold. Ahmed's eyes locked onto the man. He had to know who he was. He had to know why Amina was with him. Every instinct told him to run, to cut ties with this nightmarish revelation and return to his world of control and certainty. But his feet wouldn't move. He was trapped by his own need for answers. He had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Amina's smile, the way her eyes glistened in the dim light, twisted the knife further. She had been his, but now she belonged to someone else. A sharp pang of betrayal gripped him. But then, as if the universe had sensed his torment, the door to the cafe opened. The man stepped outside, leaving Amina behind, still seated at the table. Ahmed's heart lurched. This was his chance. He couldn't let the moment slip away. His body moved instinctively, tracking the man as he walked down the street, away from the cafe. He followed at a distance, careful not to make a sound. The man didn't seem to notice. Ahmed kept his pace steady, his eyes fixed on the back of the stranger. They passed a darkened alley, then turned into a narrow side street. And that's when it happened. The man stopped. He turned, and for the first time, their eyes met. Ahmed froze. The man's eyes, cold, calculating, pierced through him. "You shouldn't have followed," the man said in a low, dangerous tone. Ahmed's blood ran cold. He didn't speak, couldn't speak. The air between them crackled with tension, thick with unspoken threat. The man stepped closer, his voice a whisper. "You're in deeper than you know." Before Ahmed could respond, the man turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadows as if he had never been there. Ahmed stood still, the words echoing in his mind. Deeper than you know. What had he stumbled into? What was Amina involved in? The questions flooded him like a torrent, too overwhelming to contain. He had to get back to the car. He had to find out everything before it was too late. He turned, his body trembling, and hurried back toward the street. But this time, he wasn't alone. The air seemed heavier, the night more oppressive. The shadows felt longer. And as he approached the black sedan, he knew this was just the beginning. The car sat under the dim streetlight, the headlights casting long, eerie beams across the pavement. Ahmed's heartbeat thundered in his chest as he walked toward it, his mind racing with the chilling words of the man. Deeper than you know. His hand reached for the door handle, but then a flicker of movement caught his eye. Someone was in the back seat. The blood drained from his face. He stopped, frozen in place. Who was in the car? His driver was supposed to be waiting outside. With a sharp breath, Ahmed pulled open the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. But the figure in the back seat wasn't his driver. It was a woman. She sat there, still as a statue, her eyes locked on him. Amina. Ahmed's stomach twisted. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice shaking with the intensity of his fear. Amina didn't answer. She just stared at him, her face pale in the dim light. The silence between them stretched, suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Finally, Amina spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're watching us." The words hit Ahmed like a slap, his heart stalling in his chest. Who was watching them? Who was she talking about? Before he could ask another question, Amina's eyes flicked to the side, toward the alley they had just passed. Ahmed followed her gaze. A dark figure stepped out of the shadows, moving with an eerie grace. It was the man, the same man from the cafe. His footsteps echoed in the stillness as he closed the distance between them. "Get in the car," he said, his voice low and urgent. Amina obeyed without hesitation, sliding over to the other side of the vehicle. Ahmed hesitated. This couldn't be happening. What had Amina gotten herself into? Was she part of something dangerous? The man's gaze turned sharp as he looked at Ahmed. "Get in," he repeated, his tone commanding. Ahmed's mind raced. His instinct screamed at him to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. Everything felt like it was closing in. He knew, without a doubt, that his life would never be the same. Swallowing hard, Ahmed stepped into the back seat of the car, the door clicking shut behind him. The man slid in beside him, his presence overwhelming. Amina remained silent, her gaze fixed forward, as if she knew this was beyond her control now. The car began to move, the engine humming as they drove away from the city's heart. The streets blurred past them, unfamiliar and cold. Ahmed felt trapped, suffocated by the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. What was Amina hiding? Why had she allowed this man into their lives? The man turned to face him, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You've seen too much already," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Ahmed's breath caught in his throat. What did that mean? Why had he warned him? Ahmed glanced around, his eyes darting between the dimly lit buildings. A heavy silence hung over the street, oppressive and unnerving. He felt the weight of every passing second, every breath like a hammering drumbeat. Should he go back to the car? Was it safer there? No. He couldn't leave, not yet. He had to confront Amina. He had to find out everything. With shaky hands, he pulled out his phone, his fingers moving almost mechanically. He called the driver, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay where you are. I need you to follow me." The driver's voice crackled through the line, confused but compliant. "Yes, sir. Right away." The call ended. Ahmed didn't waste another moment. His feet carried him back toward the cafe. His breath shallow, he tried to steady his nerves. As he neared the window, his heart twisted painfully in his chest. Amina and the man were still inside, but now they weren't just talking. They were laughing too loudly, too freely. The man reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Amina didn't pull away. The sight burned like acid, searing his insides. Was this some kind of game to her? Had she been playing him the whole time? His mind screamed with fury, with confusion. But still, he stood there, frozen, helpless. A part of him wanted to burst through the door, confront them both. But he couldn't, not yet. Something told him to wait, to let it unfold. Ahmed's eyes locked onto the man. He had to know who he was. He had to know why Amina was with him. Every instinct told him to run, to cut ties with this nightmarish revelation and return to his world of control and certainty. But his feet wouldn't move. He was trapped by his own need for answers. He had to face the truth no matter how much it hurt. Amina's smile, the way her eyes glistened in the dim light, twisted the knife further. She had been his, but now she belonged to someone else. A sharp pang of betrayal gripped him. But then, as if the universe had sensed his torment, the door to the cafe opened. The man stepped outside, leaving Amina behind, still seated at the table. Ahmed's heart lurched. This was his chance. He couldn't let the moment slip away. His body moved instinctively, tracking the man as he walked down the street, away from the cafe. He followed at a distance, careful not to make a sound. The man didn't seem to notice. Ahmed kept his pace steady, his eyes fixed on the back of the stranger. They passed a darkened alley, then turned into a narrow side street. And that's when it happened. The man stopped. He turned, and for the first time, their eyes met. Ahmed froze. The man's eyes, cold, calculating, pierced through him. "You shouldn't have followed," the man said in a low, dangerous tone. Ahmed's blood ran cold. He didn't speak, couldn't speak. The air between them crackled with tension, thick with unspoken threat. The man stepped closer, his voice a whisper. "You're in deeper than you know." Before Ahmed could respond, the man turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadows as if he had never been there. Ahmed stood still, the words echoing in his mind. Deeper than you know. What had he stumbled into? What was Amina involved in? The questions flooded him like a torrent, too overwhelming to contain. He had to get back to the car. He had to find out everything before it was too late. He turned, his body trembling, and hurried back toward the street. But this time he wasn't alone. The air seemed heavier, the night more oppressive. The shadows felt longer. And as he approached the black sedan, he knew this was just the beginning. The car sat under the dim streetlight, the headlights casting long, eerie beams across the pavement. Ahmed's heartbeat thundered in his chest as he walked toward it, his mind racing with the chilling words of the man. Deeper than you know. His hand reached for the door handle, but then a flicker of movement caught his eye. Someone was in the back seat. The blood drained from his face. He stopped, frozen in place. Who was in the car? His driver was supposed to be waiting outside. With a sharp breath, Ahmed pulled open the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. But the figure in the back seat wasn't his driver. It was a woman. She sat there, still as a statue, her eyes locked on him. Amina. Ahmed's stomach twisted. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice shaking with the intensity of his fear. Amina didn't answer. She just stared at him, her face pale in the dim light. The silence between them stretched, suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Finally, Amina spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're watching us." The words hit Ahmed like a slap, his heart stalling in his chest. Who was watching them? Who was she talking about? Before he could ask another question, Amina's eyes flicked to the side, toward the alley they had just passed. Ahmed followed her gaze. A dark figure stepped out of the shadows, moving with an eerie grace. It was the man, the same man from the cafe. His footsteps echoed in the stillness as he closed the distance between them. "Get in the car," he said, his voice low and urgent. Amina obeyed without hesitation, sliding over to the other side of the vehicle. Ahmed hesitated. This couldn't be happening. What had Amina gotten herself into? Was she part of something dangerous? The man's gaze turned sharp as he looked at Ahmed. "Get in," he repeated, his tone commanding. Ahmed's mind raced. His instinct screamed at him to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. Everything felt like it was closing in. He knew, without a doubt, that his life would never be the same. Swallowing hard, Ahmed stepped into the back seat of the car, the door clicking shut behind him. The man slid in beside him, his presence overwhelming. Amina remained silent, her gaze fixed forward, as if she knew this was beyond her control now. The car began to move, the engine humming as they drove away from the city's heart. The streets blurred past them, unfamiliar and cold. Ahmed felt trapped, suffocated by the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. What was Amina hiding? Why had she allowed this man into their lives? The man turned to face him, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You've seen too much already," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Ahmed's breath caught in his throat. What did that mean? The man continued, leaning in closer. Amina wasn't the only one with secrets. A chill ran through Ahmed's veins as the weight of the words hit him. What was he about to learn? Where were they taking him? Amina's face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, regret, or perhaps guilt. The car sped on, and Ahmed knew in that moment that everything was spiraling out of control. Nothing would ever be the same. The car's tires hummed on the pavement, the sound oddly soothing despite the storm of panic raging inside Ahmed. The man sat next to him, his presence suffocating, his eyes calculating, never leaving Ahmed's face. Amina remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. It was as if she had completely surrendered, like she no longer cared what happened next. The atmosphere in the car was thick, oppressive, with only the hum of the engine to break the silence. Ahmed felt every second stretch into eternity. His mind raced. Amina's silence spoke volumes. What was she involved in? What had she done? The man leaned forward, his breath almost a whisper in the tense air. "You've been living a lie, Ahmed," he said softly. "And now, it's time to wake up." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. A lie. What was he talking about? Amina looked out the window, her face pale, almost like she was bracing for something. But Ahmed couldn't look away from the man. "What do you mean?" Ahmed's voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper, as if the words were too heavy to speak. The man smiled, a cold, knowing smile that made Ahmed's skin crawl. You think you know your wife. You think you know everything about her, about your life, but you don't. Not even close. His eyes locked onto Ahmed's, and for a moment, the world outside the car seemed to fade away. You think she's been faithful? You think she's been the perfect wife? Ahmed's stomach twisted. What was this man implying? Amina shifted in her seat, but didn't say a word. You've been blinded by your wealth, your success, the man continued. You never stopped to look beyond the surface. But there's a much darker story. A story that Amina's been keeping from you. A story that's been unfolding right under your nose. The words echoed in Ahmed's head, each one a dagger twisting deeper into his heart. He wanted to shout at the man to stop, to tell him it wasn't true, that Amina couldn't possibly be hiding something so sinister. But the look in the man's eyes made him hesitate. Everything in Ahmed's gut told him that this was no lie. The man paused, letting the silence stretch. Then, as if satisfied by Ahmed's response, he spoke again. You're part of something much bigger, Ahmed, and so is she. You're both entangled in a game you don't understand. A game with rules you'll never see coming. His words were like ice in Ahmed's veins. A game? What did that mean? What are you talking about? Ahmed managed to ask, his voice shaking now, the raw panic creeping in. The man's eyes darkened. Amina, he said, turning toward her for the first time since getting into the car, has been a pawn for years. But now, she's become more than that. She's a player, and she's been orchestrating everything you thought you controlled. The man turned back to Ahmed, his eyes cold as ice. And you've been the fool. Ahmed felt the ground slip out from beneath him. Amina, the woman he loved, the woman he trusted more than anything, she had been lying to him all along. The pain in his chest was unbearable now, like his heart was being crushed. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his voice caught in his throat. Amina finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. It's not what you think, Ahmed, but the man wasn't done. You need to understand, he said, his voice low and menacing. You've been playing into their hands. Both of you have. Amina turned to Ahmed, her eyes finally meeting his. There was no regret in them, no apology, only a cold detachment. You don't know who they are, Ahmed. You don't understand what we've been a part of, she said softly. But you will. Soon enough. The car began to slow. Ahmed's heart raced as he realized they were pulling into a secluded, unfamiliar part of the city. A stretch of deserted warehouses loomed ahead, shadows swallowing them whole. A strange sense of dread washed over him. Where were they taking him? What was going on? Before he could ask, the car came to a stop. The man opened the door without a word. Amina followed, stepping out first. Ahmed hesitated, his mind a blur of confusion, anger, and fear. He wanted answers. He needed to know what was happening. But all he knew now was that he was no longer in control. The air outside the car was cold, damp, and carried an unsettling stillness. The warehouses stretched endlessly before him, their shadows looming like silent giants. Amina stepped out, moving with an eerie calmness, like someone who had already accepted the inevitable. The man followed her, his eyes never leaving Ahmed's face. Come on, he said, his voice sharp, commanding. Ahmed had no choice. His body moved as if guided by some unseen force, stepping into the dark, the sound of his shoes echoing off the pavement. Each step felt heavier than the last, his mind screaming with questions. What was this place? Where was he being led? They passed rows of dilapidated buildings, their windows shattered, their facades cracked and peeling. It felt like a place abandoned by time, forgotten by the world. Where are you taking me? Ahmed finally demanded, his voice rising with frustration. The man didn't answer at first, leading him deeper into the maze of dark alleys and broken streets. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. to where everything ends, Ahmed, and where everything begins. The words made no sense. Every part of Ahmed's mind was screaming that this was a mistake, that he needed to turn back, to find a way out. But the suffocating pull of the situation kept him moving forward. Finally, they stopped in front of an imposing warehouse. It was larger than the others, its entrance guarded by two men standing stoically at the door. The man turned to Ahmed, his eyes cold. "This is where your life changes." Amina stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable. The man gestured to the doors. "Go inside." Ahmed's heart raced, his body tensing as he glanced at Amina, searching for any sign of reassurance. But there was nothing. No comfort, no apology. Just silence. "Why are you doing this?" Ahmed asked, his voice strained, desperate. Amina's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Because it's too late to turn back now, Ahmed. You've already crossed the point of no return." He opened the door and gestured for Ahmed to step inside. The cold air hit him as soon as he crossed the threshold. The space was vast, filled with shadows and echoes of something dark. The distant sound of footsteps, muffled voices, it was all too much. His heart was hammering in his chest as he moved deeper into the building, following the man and Amina. They led him to a large, open room with a high ceiling, the kind of room that made the air feel thick, oppressive. At the center of the room was a table, and sitting around it were several figures, their faces obscured by shadows. A tall man stood and moved toward them, his footsteps heavy, deliberate. He stopped in front of Ahmed, studying him carefully, his eyes cold, calculating. "You must be Ahmed," the man said, his voice deep, resonant. Ahmed didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of the moment crushed him. The man stepped closer, his gaze never wavering. "You've walked into a world far darker than you ever imagined," he said softly. "And you've dragged your wife into it with you." The words hit Ahmed like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat, his mind whirling with confusion. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The man smiled, almost pityingly, before he turned to Amina. "You've kept your secret well," he said. But now it's time for him to know the truth. Ahmed's legs felt weak beneath him as Amina's expression finally softened, just for a moment. She looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "Regret? Guilt? I never wanted this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then why?" Ahmed asked, his voice trembling with raw emotion. But Amina only shook her head, as if there was no answer that would ever make sense. The tall man turned back to Ahmed, his expression stern. "The truth is simple, really," he said, his voice taking on a cold edge. "Amina isn't who you think she is, and neither are you." Ahmed's head spun, the room spinning around him. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it was a truth he couldn't bear to accept. Amina had never been the woman he thought she was. And worse, he had never been the man he thought he was either. Everything was a lie. The air in the room grew thick with tension, every word hanging like a weight. Amina's silence only deepened Ahmed's confusion, her face pale, almost resigned. The tall man's eyes glinted, studying him with an unsettling intensity. "You were never meant to know, Ahmed," he continued, his voice a low rumble. "The life you thought you led, it was all part of a plan much bigger than you." Ahmed's chest tightened as his mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. What did he mean? Amina wasn't just a wife. She was part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. "Who are you?" Ahmed demanded, his voice breaking through the suffocating silence. The tall man's smile deepened, a cruel twist of his lips. "We've been watching you for years, Ahmed. You and Amina. Your wealth, your connections, all part of a larger game. A game of power, control, and influence. Ahmed's head spun with the words, his vision narrowing. What game? What was this man talking about? Amina finally moved, her eyes flicking to him, her face empty, unreadable. You're not who you think you are, she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself. None of us are. The words shattered Ahmed. He felt his legs begin to shake, but he fought to keep his composure. What do you mean? He whispered, barely able to speak. The man in front of him stepped closer, the air between them heavy with the weight of his words. You've been part of a much bigger network, the man said, his voice chillingly calm. Amina was brought into it long before she met you. She's been playing a role, and so have you. Ahmed's world seemed to crumble around him, the truth settling over him like an icy shroud. Amina had been playing him. Everything he thought he knew about her, about their life together, was a lie. She's been my asset, the man continued. Her loyalty was never to you. It was always to the cause. And now it's time for you to play your part. Amina's eyes flickered with something, but she said nothing. The man turned to her, his gaze cold, and she flinched slightly. You've done well, Amina, he said, voice full of approval. But now, your husband is ready to join us, whether he wants to or not. Ahmed's throat tightened, panic flooding him. What do you want from me? His voice cracked with desperation. The man's eyes bored into him. We need your resources, your influence, your connections, he said, each word measured and precise. You've been a key player all along, you just never realized it. But now, it's time for you to make the choice. Join us fully, or be eliminated. The last words rang in the air, cold and final. Ahmed staggered back, his mind racing to catch up with the chaos unfolding before him. His breath was shallow, his chest tight. You're not giving me a choice, Ahmed choked out, his hands trembling. The man smiled darkly, unfazed. Choice is an illusion, Ahmed. You've always been part of this. And now, you'll either be our ally or our enemy. Amina's eyes met his for the first time in what felt like forever. Her gaze was not filled with love, not with remorse, only with cold resolve. You've always been a part of this, Ahmed, she said softly, her voice distant. I never wanted you to know, but you had to. It's the only way for everything to unfold as it should. The finality of her words hit him like a wave. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to lash out. But there was nothing left to fight for. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if everything in his world was about to collapse. The tall man took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Ahmed's face. Make your decision, he said. You're either with us or against us. The choice was clear, but it was also impossible. And in that moment, Ahmed realized he was no longer the man he thought he was. Not anymore. The weight of the man's words crushed down on Ahmed, leaving him feeling hollow. His mind struggled to grasp the reality before him. Everything he had built, his wealth, his family, his life, was now part of some vast, unseen network, a network that had been manipulating him all along. The tall man's eyes gleamed as he watched Ahmed's internal struggle. He knew the moment of choice was coming. Amina stood motionless beside him, her face expressionless, as if she had already made her peace with whatever was about to unfold. Ahmed's heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. Why? He finally whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Why did you marry me? Why bring me into this? Amina's eyes softened for a brief moment, a flicker of something in her gaze that made Ahmed's breath catch. She looked almost regretful. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, she said quietly, almost as if to herself. I didn't expect to care about you, Ahmed, but I did. And now here we are. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. The tall man stepped forward, his expression unreadable. You've been part of this from the beginning, Ahmed, he said, his voice calm but menacing. Your marriage to Amina, your success, it was all calculated. You were a tool in a much larger game. But you can still play your part. You can still be useful. Ahmed's mind reeled. A tool? All of this, his life, had been a game to these people? Amina's voice broke through his haze of confusion. I never wanted to hurt you, she said softly, her eyes now filled with something he couldn't name. But there are bigger forces at play here, Ahmed. Forces we can't escape from. A cold shiver ran down Ahmed's spine as the realization hit him. Amina had never truly been his. She had always been part of something darker, something that was beyond his understanding. The man turned his gaze back to Ahmed, his smile now gone, replaced by something far colder. The choice is yours, he said again, his voice almost a command. You can accept the truth and join us, or you can fight against it. But know this. Fighting us will cost you everything. Ahmed's stomach churned. He had no idea what to do, no idea how to break free from this twisted reality. For the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. The silence between them felt like an eternity, suffocating, oppressive. The tall man took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. You'll never escape us, Ahmed. You're already in too deep. The words echoed in the room, each one sinking deeper into Ahmed's soul. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but there was nothing left inside him but a hollow emptiness. Amina's eyes met his one last time. I'm sorry, she whispered, and then it happened. The tall man moved with a speed that took Ahmed by surprise. Before he could react, the man grabbed his arm, gripping it tightly. You've made your choice, he said, his voice low and final. A sudden force surged through Ahmed's body, making his muscles seize in pain. He gasped, struggling to break free, but it was useless. The man was too strong. Amina stood still, watching as the tall man moved behind Ahmed, his grip tightening. Everything around him seemed to blur. What is happening? Suddenly, the room went dark, the shadows swallowing him whole. A sharp pain shot through his head, and then silence. When Ahmed opened his eyes again, everything was different. The world around him felt distant, distorted. He wasn't sure where he was. What had they done to him? Had he made a choice? Had it even mattered? The room was empty now. The tall man, Amina, gone. He was alone. A part of him wanted to scream, but another part of him was numb. Was this the end of his story? Or was it just the beginning? The darkness loomed, and all Ahmed could do was wait, uncertain of what came next. Was there still a way out? Or was he already too far gone? The silence that followed felt suffocating. Ahmed stood alone, the room closing in around him like the walls were slowly pressing against his chest. His mind raced, the thoughts spinning faster than he could catch them. Everything he had known, everything he had trusted, gone. Amina's face flickered in his mind, her cold eyes, her apology. But it was all meaningless now. She had been part of this all along, part of a world he never even knew existed. He staggered toward the nearest wall, gripping it to steady himself, his breath shallow and quick. What now? What was left? A life built on lies, on manipulation. A life that was never truly his. The door behind him creaked open, and Ahmed snapped his head around, his heart leaping in his chest. Was it the tall man, Amina? But no. It was a figure in a dark coat, their face hidden by the shadow of the doorway. For a moment, everything stood still, as if the world had held its breath. Then the figure stepped forward, revealing a pair of cold, calculating eyes. Ahmed, the voice was smooth, calm, but there was something dangerous in it. It's time to wake up. Ahmed's mind struggled to focus. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his voice wouldn't come. He was paralyzed, gripped by fear and confusion. The figure approached, walking slowly toward him. You've been living in a dream, the voice continued, its tone strangely reassuring. It's time to face the reality. The words hit Ahmed like a slap to the face. A dream? Reality? What was real anymore? The figure reached out, grabbing him by the arm, pulling him away from the wall. Ahmed wanted to resist, but the grip was too strong. You have a role to play, Ahmed, the voice whispered, as the figure led him toward a door at the far side of the room. His thoughts scattered in every direction, but the figure's grip held him firm, guiding him like a puppet on invisible strings. What role? Ahmed's voice cracked, barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he shoved Ahmed through the door, into another dimly lit room. This one was smaller, with walls that seemed to pulse with some dark energy, like the room itself was alive. Ahmed's heart raced as the door slammed shut behind him. He was trapped. The figure stepped aside, revealing a series of screens on the far wall, each displaying something different. Images, people, numbers, all flashing in rapid succession. Look, the figure commanded. Ahmed's eyes scanned the screens, the images blurring before him, too fast to make sense of. And then one screen froze. It was a video of Amina, her face pale, her eyes empty. The man beside her was familiar, the tall man from before. The video played, showing them talking, planning, plotting. Amina was speaking in a language Ahmed couldn't understand, her voice cold, calculated. And then the words became clear. He's too weak. We need to break him. Only then will he be ready. The breath caught in Ahmed's throat. Amina. She had never cared for him. She had been playing him from the very beginning. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The figure's voice was now right behind him, sending a chill down his spine. You see, Ahmed, you were never part of her world. She was always using you, always manipulating you. But you're not alone in this. There are others just like you. Ahmed turned toward the voice, his eyes wide with horror. What are you talking about? He gasped. The figure smiled, but it was cruel, empty. Every person in your life, every relationship, every connection, they're all part of the game. Amina wasn't the first, and she won't be the last. The figure stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Ahmed's with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down his spine. You've been marked, Ahmed. You've crossed the line, and now you must face the consequences. Ahmed's legs gave out beneath him. He sank to his knees, his mind spinning, his vision blurring. The figure's shadow loomed over him, heavy and oppressive. Get up, the voice commanded. You can't escape. No one can. The words echoed in his mind, bouncing around like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Was this it? Was this his fate? The figure turned, moving toward the exit. You'll understand soon enough, he said. Everyone does, in the end. The door slammed shut again, leaving Ahmed alone in the cold, dark room. The screens flickered around him, images flashing so fast they almost made him dizzy. But through it all, there was one thing that remained clear. There was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. The game had already begun, and he was its pawn. The room felt smaller, closing in on him as the screens continued their erratic dance of images and flashing lights. Ahmed's breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale trembling with the weight of what he had seen. The cold, stark truth was settling over him like a heavy fog. He had been nothing more than a piece in a game he had never asked to play. His mind was still reeling, trying to make sense of the images he had seen. Amina, her cold words, the manipulation, the figure's cryptic statements about others just like him. The truth gnawed at him, relentless, a constant reminder of how little control he had over his own life. How could I not see it? He thought, his head throbbing with confusion. Everything, the life he had worked so hard to build, the love he thought he shared with Amina, was nothing more than an illusion. He was nothing more than a pawn, The realization sank in like a stone. But it wasn't the despair that took hold of him now. It was something else, something darker. Rage. The door behind him creaked open again, and Ahmed's head snapped toward it. The same figure stepped back inside, his silhouette a shadow in the dim light. "You're not the first to feel betrayed," the figure said calmly, as though reading Ahmed's thoughts. Ahmed clenched his fists, fighting the storm of emotions churning inside him. "I want out," he growled, his voice raw, desperate. "I want out of this." The figure's eyes glinted with amusement. "You don't get to choose that," he said, his voice almost pitying. "There is no out, Ahmed. There never was." Ahmed stood up slowly, his legs still shaky from the onslaught of revelations, but the anger inside him was sharp, focused. "You're lying," he spat, his voice hoarse. "I have a choice. I can leave this. I can walk away." The figure's gaze softened, almost mockingly. "No, you can't. You've been marked from the start. This game, it's not about choices. It's about survival. You're already too deep. There's no turning back now." Ahmed felt his world crumbling beneath him again, the weight of those words crushing him. "Then what do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice shaky but filled with defiance. "If I'm just a pawn, then why am I still here? Why not just finish me off?" The figure paused, considering him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Because you still have value," he said finally, his tone almost gentle. "There are forces at play here that you don't understand. But you will. In time, you will understand what you have to do." Ahmed shook his head in disbelief, his mind whirling. "What do you mean?" he asked, barely able to form the words. "What do you want me to do?" The figure stepped closer, his eyes cold and unwavering. "Join us," he said simply. "Be part of something larger than yourself. Stop fighting it. You'll never win against the network that runs this world. You're better off accepting your place." For a moment, Ahmed didn't speak. The words hung in the air, suffocating him. He could feel the weight of them pressing down on him, pushing him into submission. But somewhere deep inside, the anger flared again, a small spark of defiance that refused to die. "No," Ahmed said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "I'll never join you. I won't be part of this." The figure's smile faded, his face hardening. "You don't have a choice," he repeated. "This is your fate now." Before Ahmed could respond, the figure turned on his heel and walked back toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, he paused and glanced over his shoulder one last time. "You'll change your mind," he said softly. "Everyone does, eventually." And with that, he disappeared into the hallway, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. Ahmed stood frozen in the middle of the room, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He could feel the weight of the walls closing in on him once again. "This isn't over," he thought, his fists clenched at his sides. "Asterisk, I will fight. I will find a way out of this asterisk." But deep down, a small part of him wondered if it was already too late. Was there any way to escape the web that had been spun around him? Was there any way to regain control of his life? The world outside felt distant now, a place that belonged to someone else. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. And in the end, he knew the truth. There was no escaping the game. The quiet in the room was suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for Ahmed to make the next move. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind spinning in every direction, trapped in a storm of thoughts he couldn't control. His heart still pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how powerless he had become. He could feel the weight of his choices, or the lack of them, pressing down on him, suffocating any hope he might have had. But there was something inside him that refused to fully break, something that still burned, no matter how small the flame had become. "I'm not done," Ahmed thought, clenching his fists tighter. I will find a way out. But how? The world around him seemed so distant now. He had trusted everything, his wealth, his influence, his relationships, thinking they were his to control. And now nothing was his, not even Amina. A part of him felt like screaming, but his voice wouldn't come. His throat felt raw, constricted by the weight of the truth. The life he thought he knew was nothing more than an illusion. He was a pawn in someone else's game. But that didn't mean he had to play by their rules. As the minutes dragged on, a strange sense of calm began to settle over him. Not because he had accepted the truth, but because something deep within him had clicked. He didn't have to accept it. Not yet. Ahmed glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the dim lights flickering overhead. He needed to think. He needed to gather whatever was left of his sanity and plan. He wasn't going to just roll over and die in this cold, forgotten room. He wasn't going to let them win. The door was still closed. He took a few slow steps toward it, his feet heavy on the floor. There had to be an escape, a crack in this twisted reality where he could still slip through. But what was the price? Would they come for him if he tried? They will, Ahmed thought bitterly. Asterisk, but they've underestimated me. They don't know who I am. Not yet, asterisk. His mind raced again, calculating his next move, wondering what he still had to work with. There had to be something, some way to break free from this. And then it hit him. The screens, the flashing lights, the images. It wasn't just surveillance, it was a way in. He turned back to the screens, his pulse quickening. The figure had said everyone had a role to play, but they never said what would happen if someone refused to play. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the nearest screen. Maybe there was a way to turn it against them. Maybe he could rewrite his own story. His mind flashed back to the man's words. You'll change your mind. Everyone does. Eventually. Ahmed smiled grimly, his eyes narrowing. Asterisk, not me. Not this time, asterisk. He wasn't going to let them decide his fate. He wasn't going to let anyone control his life anymore. The screens were still flashing. Images of people, places, names, and coded messages. It was all connected. There had to be a way to find a weakness, to exploit it. As he studied the patterns, something caught his eye, a slight glitch, a flicker in the data. His heart raced as he zoomed in, focusing all his attention on that single point of vulnerability. It was a small crack in their system, but a crack was all he needed. Without thinking, he tapped a few keys on the console. A small window opened, revealing lines of code. Complex, but familiar. He had spent years in business, manipulating data, organizing connections. Now he could use those same skills for something else, something bigger than himself. His fingers flew across the keys, the fear and adrenaline fueling his actions. He was no longer just playing their game. He was going to change it. As he entered the final command, the screens flickered once more, then went black. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the sound of the door behind him creaked open. Ahmed froze, his breath caught in his throat. Was it the tall figure? Had they discovered what he was doing? He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The door swung open, but this time, it wasn't the same shadowed figure that entered. It was Amina. She stood in the doorway, her face unreadable, her posture stiff. For a moment, their eyes locked, and time seemed to freeze. Then, she stepped forward. Amina, Ahmed whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't speak at first, just watched him, her eyes cold and distant. The room seemed to get even darker, as if the air itself had shifted. I never wanted it to be like this, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, filled with a sadness that made Ahmed's heart twist. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Then why? He demanded, the pain in his chest unbearable. Why did you do this? Why betray me? Amina's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. But something was different now. Ahmed wasn't the same man he was when he walked in this room, and neither was she. "I'm done," he said, his voice strong now. "You've made your choices, and I've made mine." He turned away from her, heading straight for the door. No more lies, no more games. This time, the game was going to be on his terms. Amina's footsteps followed him, hesitant but unrelenting. Her presence in the room felt like an anchor, but also like a shadow that could no longer hold him down. He could feel the anger inside him boiling over. The betrayal, the lies, all of it. He had been trapped for too long. The darkness in the hallway didn't scare him anymore. There was nothing left to fear. But then, as his hand gripped the doorframe and his foot stepped forward, a cold voice broke through the silence. "You don't have to do this." It was Amina again, her voice steady, but there was something in it, something raw, almost pleading. Ahmed froze, the words sinking deep into his chest. He didn't know why, but he couldn't move forward. Not yet. "I do have to," he said, his voice low, firm. "You made your choices. Now I have to make mine." Amina's breath hitched, but she didn't move closer. "I never wanted this for you," she said softly, her voice almost fragile. "I never wanted to hurt you." Ahmed turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "But you did," he said, his words sharp, the pain of the betrayal still raw. "You lied to me, Amina. All this time, I thought I knew you, but you were never real with me." Amina's face softened, the coldness in her eyes flickering for a brief moment. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she whispered. "I got caught up in something I couldn't get out of. I thought if I stayed close to you, I could." "You thought you could control me," Ahmed interrupted, his anger flaring again. "You thought I was just another piece in your game." Amina flinched, the words stinging more than she let on. The silence between them stretched, but there was no more comfort in it, no more pretending. Ahmed's mind was racing again, the anger inside him now mingled with something else, something that felt like resolve. He wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to let them use him anymore. "You've made your choice," he repeated, his voice cold now, "and I've made mine." Amina's eyes filled with something. Was it regret? Sorrow? But whatever it wasn't enough. "I have to go," he said finally, turning back toward the hallway. This time, when he stepped forward, she didn't stop him. He walked down the dark corridor, each step bringing him closer to the unknown, closer to whatever came next. The sound of his footsteps echoed around him, each one like a drumbeat in his chest, steady and unyielding. This was his escape. This was his fight. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness wrapping itself around him like a cloak. But Ahmed didn't look back. He couldn't. Not anymore. As he reached the end of the hallway, he found another door. The hinges creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a vast, empty space. It looked like an office, cold, impersonal, with rows of computer terminals blinking with faint green light. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, and there it was, a control panel. This was it, the heart of everything. He could feel the weight of the decisions that had led him here, the anger and the betrayal swirling around him like a storm. But there was no turning back now. He moved toward the panel, his fingers hovering over the keys. There were so many things he could do, so many ways to tear down the system that had trapped him. But what was the right choice? As his fingers finally hovered over the keys, he remembered Amina's words. "You don't have to do this." But what was there left to do? The people who had controlled him were watching. They would always be watching. The only way out was to destroy their game. With one final breath, Ahmed's fingers slammed down on the keyboard. The screens in front of him blinked to life, the code running faster than he could track it. Everything he knew, everything they had built, was starting to collapse. He didn't know if he could stop it, but for the first time, he felt like he had control again. The doors to the room burst open behind him, but he didn't turn. There was no going back now. Let them come. He was done being their pawn. The doors slammed open with a force that rattled the walls, and Ahmed's heart raced, but his fingers didn't falter on the keyboard. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, the code flashing faster and faster, spiraling into chaos. Behind him, footsteps echoed, the sound sharp and deliberate. But he didn't look. He couldn't afford to be distracted now. The weight of the room pressed against him, but the surge of power he felt from finally taking control, however temporary, was overwhelming. Asterisk, this is it. This is the moment. I have to finish this asterisk. A voice broke through the noise, cold and calculating. You really think you can undo all of this, Ahmed? It was the same figure, the one from the dark room. He was standing at the entrance, his silhouette framed by the harsh, flickering lights behind him. His eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had seen it all, someone who didn't fear the collapse of a system. No matter what you do, the figure continued, his tone low, you're already too deep. You can't escape this. No one does. Ahmed's fingers trembled, but he didn't stop typing. Asterisk, they want me to doubt myself. They want me to believe there's no way out. Asterisk. He couldn't let them control him anymore. Is this what you wanted? The figure asked again, stepping closer, his voice now just a whisper. To tear it all down. Ahmed didn't reply. The pressure building inside him was almost unbearable, but the resolve inside him was stronger than ever. He glanced at the screen one last time. The final command was almost ready, and then it hit him. Something was wrong. The code, it wasn't just running. It was responding, reacting. Asterisk, they're watching me. They always are. Asterisk. His fingers froze on the keyboard as the realization set in. The system was designed to adapt, to trap, to control. Even now, as he tried to break free, it was learning, evolving, preparing for his next move. The room felt colder. The air felt thinner. He wasn't going to win this by just typing commands into a console. The footsteps behind him were closer now. He turned slowly to face the figure. I don't need to escape, Ahmed said, his voice steady. I need to end this. All of it. The figure's lips curled into a smile. You think you can destroy the system? He asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. You're too late. I know, Ahmed replied, his eyes hardening. But I'm going to make sure it's never the same again. The figure took a step forward, then another, like a predator stalking its prey. You don't understand what you're dealing with, he said, his voice now lower, more menacing. This is bigger than you, bigger than anything you've ever known. There's no escape, no victory, just endless, relentless power. Ahmed stood his ground. The fear that had gripped him for so long was slipping away, replaced with something sharper, something more dangerous. He wasn't afraid anymore. I don't need a victory, Ahmed said. I just need to tear it down. Before the figure could respond, Ahmed hit the final key. The lights flickered one last time, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, everything went black. For a moment, the world was silent, and then came the sound of alarms, screeching, wailing, a high-pitched, ear-splitting sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the air around them. The figure's face twisted into something dark, something angry. And no, he shouted, his voice booming, but the sound was lost in the chaos. The screens in the room were now blank. Every system was down. The power grid flickered and died. And the darkness, it was endless. Ahmed could barely hear his own thoughts over the din, but he felt it. He could feel the shift in power, the collapse of the web they had tried to weave around him. For the first time, the system had failed. It wasn't over, not yet, but it was a start. As the alarms continued to wail, A door opened somewhere in the distance. Footsteps echoed again, closer this time. Ahmed didn't turn around. He knew who was coming. But it didn't matter. This was his moment. His fight wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about destroying everything they had built. For the first time in a long while, he was free. The alarm's blare reverberated through the air, each shrill tone more deafening than the last. The lights above flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls as the room plunged into a deeper darkness. Ahmed could feel the weight of it pressing against him, but he didn't flinch. His heart was steady now, his resolve unwavering. The systems were down. For the first time, the control, the power that had held him prisoner, was slipping away. But he knew it wasn't over. The sound of footsteps grew louder, coming from behind him. The figure, his shadow, was coming closer. The man's voice, once so calm and collected, was now thick with frustration. "You think this is it? You think you've won?" Ahmed's fingers gripped the edge of the console. He turned to face the man, his eyes burning with the fire of defiance. "I don't need to win," Ahmed said, his voice strong and cold. "I just need to make sure you lose." The figure paused, the anger flickering across his face, but it was quickly replaced with something darker, something calculating. "You don't understand," the figure hissed, his hands clenched into fists. "You can't fight this. You can't fight us. You've been controlling everything, haven't you?" Ahmed's voice was low, the words steady as they left his mouth. "But you never understood one thing." The figure took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what's that?" "That I was never meant to be controlled." Without another word, Ahmed turned back to the darkened console. His fingers moved with a calm precision, navigating the blackened screen, hunting for the final piece of the puzzle. With one final keystroke, the power surged. The lights flickered back to life, weak at first, but then strong enough to reveal the complete chaos unfolding around them. The network was crumbling. Systems that had once been so powerful now spiraled into disarray. The figure's face twisted in disbelief, his eyes wild as he stepped back. "What have you done?" But Ahmed didn't respond. He stepped away from the console, his heart still steady, his mind clear. "You should have never underestimated me," he said, his voice unwavering. The figure lunged forward, but by then it was too late. Everything they had built was gone. And for the first time, Ahmed could finally breathe. The room was silent now, save for the distant hum of failing equipment and the soft buzz of the lights flickering above. Ahmed stood alone, his fingers still hovering over the darkened console, the weight of his actions settling on him like a heavy cloak. The systems were gone, the network, the control, everything that had bound him to this life, to this game, was unraveling. He didn't feel the rush of victory that he had expected, nor the relief of escape. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, a quiet stillness that filled the room, the kind that follows when a storm finally passes. It wasn't peace. It wasn't closure. It was simply the void left behind. Behind him, the figure stood motionless, his body rigid, as if unsure whether to retreat or strike. The game had shifted, the roles had reversed, and it was clear now that the man who had once controlled everything was now powerless. Ahmed turned slowly, locking eyes with the figure for the last time. "You were right about one thing," Ahmed said quietly. "You never understood what I was capable of." The figure didn't reply, his gaze fixed, wild and uncomprehending. Ahmed knew there was no need for words anymore. The truth was too clear. This system, this web of power and manipulation, had crumbled at the touch of his fingers. The fight was over, and no amount of resistance could change that now. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what came next. There was no roadmap for this kind of freedom, no blueprint for life after the storm. But he knew one thing. The path forward would be his to choose. Without another word, Ahmed turned away from the console, the broken systems, and the shadow of the man who had tried to control him. He stepped toward the door, his steps measured and firm. As he exited into the quiet of the world beyond, the alarms and the chaos faded behind him, swallowed by the silence of a new beginning. This was his chance, his future, and for the first time in a long while, Ahmed felt the flicker of hope, faint but undeniable, begin to burn.